All right, so welcome everybody to this roundtable on democratic experimentation, sustainability transformation. So we've been, or the title of the conference is Reimagining Earth System Governance in an Era of Polycrisis. And well, actually, before I go forward, I would like to acknowledge the I would like to acknowledge the First Nations on whose land we are having this roundtable, because the session is actually co-hosted with the Sydney Environment Institute. So we're here in Sydney, and the Democratic the Working Group on Democracy. The title of this conference is on reimagining Earth system governance in an era of polycrisis, and with the intensity and urgency that we see in terms of the ecological challenges as well as the social challenges, I think it's essential to discuss also or rethink the way we govern them. But with this intensity and urgency, we often hear calls for more top-down solutions, eco-authoritarianism. But sustainability science shows quite clearly that this is not a pathway that can lead us to just and sustainable solutions. We need to incorporate diverse types of knowledge and perspectives and develop more adapted solutions. And also with the deep changes that are required, of course, considerations of justice become even more essential. We see also when approaches are taken that are not democratic, there's a lot of backlash against decisions. So there's also another argument that we need more democracy rather than less in order to cope with these challenges. But we also see that the dominant liberal democracies that we have, while they tend to perform better in terms of these sustainability challenges, they are not going far enough. We have not been able to address these ecological challenges and social challenges that we've been seeing for such a long time. So this calls for new visions of democracy. And across the world, we see that there are already many initiatives that are taking matters into their own hand in experimenting with new visions of what democracy might look like. New imaginaries of democracy beyond representation, beyond electoral democracy, beyond voting and election, towards more participatory, deliberative, or consensus-oriented forms of democracy. We see that these experiments occur at various scales. They have also very different entry points. So, for instance, we have experiments around deliberative democracy, such as climate assemblies or mini publics, but we also see initiatives at the grassroots level, sustainability initiatives that are experimenting with more forms of self-governance, where democracy also plays a huge role. So we see a broad scope of initiatives, and the literature is still quite dispersed in this regard. And with this roundtable, we want to make a contribution to bring some cases from diverse forms of experimentation together, discuss what their entry points are, so what kind of the initial motivation was to get started, what kind of alternative ways of doing democracy are practiced there, and then also discuss the cases in terms of their potential relation to sustainability transformation. So I'm very excited that we have a quite diverse panel in terms of these democratic experiments today. So it ranges from more deliberative approaches. So we have an example from Chile, from the Constitution. Constitution-making process in Chile. We have examples from more the grassroots sustainability perspective with a multi-species assembly, so also bringing in actors beyond the human. We have examples from different scales. So we have local, we have also international in Chile, but we also have the transnational example of Extinction Rebellion. And we have an example here from Australia in terms of disaster response networks, and also an example that is quite focused on transformation with living labs for transformation. So perhaps a more explicitly experimental approach, you could say. So I'm very excited to have this fascinating list of speakers here. We will start with our first speaker, David Schlossberg, who you probably already have seen in some of the previous panels. So he's director of the City Environment Institute, so also co-host. I would like to invite him and also following the other speakers to give a small pitch of 5 to 6 minutes, addressing these questions that I've already raised. So the floor is yours, David.
Thanks so much, Julia. So I want to talk a little bit about some work that I've been doing in a number of places, but I'm really interested in the relationship between climate change, the impact of climate change, climate turbulence, and democratic responses, democratic experimentation. So I'm quite interested in the vulnerability to climate change, the real experience of this era of turbulence. I'm interested in how that sort of reality of disturbance and displacement and detachment is going to be sort of an ongoing experience for human and non-human alike. And one of the ways I put this is that there's a lot of focus on thinking about climate migration, that people are going to be uprooted, that places are going to be changed and be uprooted. But it's really crucial to think about the way that community is decimated without people leaving, that we're seeing people increasingly unsettled in place, disruptions to place without being displaced from them. And so in the response to that kind of turbulence and displacement in place, there have been a number of examples of democratic action in the face of climate disasters or in response to government inaction on climate or sustainability or resilience and adaptation. And that's the kind of experimentation I want to talk about here, mainly the work of community groups working and organizing on disaster response, resilience, and climate adaptation. But first, a little bit on experimentation. And I'm heavily under the influence of something that Harriet Bulkley recently wrote about the fact that we might actually be in a condition of permanent democratic experimentation, given the climate crisis, that forms of democratic experimentation are becoming more prominent, mainly for instrumental reasons, because there's some promise of novel solutions to complex problems, that this kind of experimentation allows for a process of trial and error that can generate learning needed to address uncertain, ongoing, wicked problems. Experimentation is a way or response to the reality that rules and norms have been displaced and creates sort of productive new practices amid the kind of turbulence that I'm talking about. I also like the way that John Myers, an environmental political theorist, puts it when he talks about experimentation as integral to the democratic project itself, especially democratic pragmatism, because it is pragmatic and pluralistic and disruptive and regenerative. So the question I'm looking at is how communities are responding to climate turbulence in experimental or democratic ways. How are they attempting to reclaim or rebuild or transform attachments to place and each other and the very functioning of communities? How are they challenging status quo government structures? What does experimentation in the face of climate disaster look like? And then what are communities' desires for such projects? So I recently led a large research team. This was funded by the New South Wales government's Disaster Risk Reduction Fund. And we examined community responses in 3 broad geographic areas for folks familiar with New South Wales: the Northern Rivers, which has been hit again and again, the Blue Mountains, which is constantly hit by fire, and the Hawkesbury, which is luckily hit by both fires and floods at different times. So we're looking at repeated heat waves, repeated bushfires, repeated flooding, and then the work that's done by civil society organizations, some more organized efficiently than others, and the work that they're doing often in the absence of, or sometimes actually, in response to the intransigence of state-based emergency services. So these community organizations, resilience organizations, emergency response organizations, have learned to know the weak spots in the state's emergency response and resilience governance, and they have filled necessary gaps in that action and in governance. Everything from saving lives, going out and rescuing people from their homes, to helping people rebuild, bringing design ideas to people to help them rebuild homes that are more flood resilient. So they want much more recognition, and this is really a key point that we heard again and again, much more recognition of the nature and the role and the importance of community-based knowledge. The knowledge that people have in place, and of the people in those places, right? There's knowledge embedded in place about the behavior of floods and rivers. There's knowledge embedded in place about the behavior of fires in forests. There's knowledge of neighborhoods, right? Who's most vulnerable, who's least mobile, who needs rescue. So these communities engage disasters with the breadth of local knowledge, and they take that knowledge and put it into practice. So they want that knowledge, well, first to be recognized as crucial to democratic action in response to climate turbulence and disasters. They don't want to be dismissed, as the state often does, as amateurs who don't really understand proper disaster response. They want that knowledge to be incorporated into governmental decision-making, but they don't want their own groups to be institutionalized, and that come back to that. But they want that knowledge incorporated into governmental decision-making and local emergency response. They want to be able to apply the local knowledge about place with more flexibility, more local experimentation than the current state governance of disasters currently allows. So the communities that we examined, they illustrate the potential of grassroots immediate democratic organizing in response to disasters, as well as democratic organizing that goes on for ongoing resilience, training, and the like. And we've done some really interesting network analysis, basically asking people in interviews, where they get information from, who do you give information to, and we just find these really dense pre-existing knowledge networks, social networks, cultural networks, material and economic networks. So this isn't, the government has called this in the past spontaneous community organizing. It's not spontaneous. It's based in pre-existing networks. Of course, government and lots of academics refer to this as social capital or social cohesion or social infrastructure, but they're really about existing democratic relationships and processes that create that social cohesion and knowledge. So we have a number of these groups that are really dedicated to expanding the reality of and the practice of social infrastructure. So they're building community around, again, responses and preparedness for disasters through various kinds of workshops, through tool sharing, through practice drills, volunteer and leadership training, a whole range of community building, democratic building, knowledge building processes. And one of the things that we are sort of pushing at this point, what we are bringing from communities to the state is a different idea about social infrastructure. So often in the disaster response and the resilience literature, social infrastructure is understood as physical places, like libraries, churches, cafes, those kinds of places that where people can meet, that can be a kind of refuge in a time of disaster. The research that we've done with disaster impacted communities shows the importance not just of buildings, but again, these democratic and inclusive networks and processes that support and inform communities, like these community resilience organizations. They're not buildings, right? They are processes and relationships. So the participants in the research emphasize this focus on processes, on networks, on services. And as one participant stressed, and I think this is going to be the title of an article, buildings do not fix things. The preparation is in the people and building the networks, right? So social infrastructure is what brings people together, it builds the connections, and it really leverages that knowledge in disaster affected communities. And it works actually to save lives, so we know this. And building such networks outside of disasters is really about building these democratic experiments and processes that are fit for purpose for addressing and responding to climate turbulence. So that's really the focus that we've had. We've also done some other research, just real briefly, that has found that community inclusion in these kinds of processes also helps people address their growing climate anxiety, right? It helps with community well-being. So democracy, democratic experimentation as a an antidote for climate anxiety as well. Again, other research that we've done. I just think there are a lot of lessons to be learned about this kind of direct and experimental community action in the face of climate change and turbulence, action based on building democracy while preparing for the worst impacts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this case already shows the intricate connections between democratic decision-making, self-organization, and filling in gaps where, well, as you highlighted, where the state is not coming in, and the importance of including diverse knowledge, which, if you didn't have these democratic process, of course, that wouldn't be possible. I want to transition directly. Well, transition is the right word. Transition over to Christian Koch, who works as a professor at the University in Amsterdam. So he works a lot on power and governing in power in the governance of sustainability transitions in particular. He will share his experiences with living labs for transformation in the Netherlands. So we're flying over to Europe now.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. It's just morning here in Amsterdam. I wanted to share some ideas on, indeed, living labs for transformation. And this is a term that is emerging more and more in science and policy. They're often called living labs, transition labs, transformation labs. And there are some differences, but I think what they all share is this notion of that we create a semi-protected space in which there's multi-stakeholder interaction, learning around a complex problem. And that there is also this notion of experimenting with solutions to that problem in there. And that can take, I think, various forms and shapes. It's about developing shared visions, about what David said is how to include this knowledge from communities in research and innovation, for instance, or policy making. About developing transition pathways, so a variety of functions. And I thought let's make it a bit more concrete by sharing some experiences from one particular project that I'm now working on with the colleagues here. And this project is called Crop Mix. It's a large Dutch funded project on agriculture. It's coordinated by the University of Wageningen. They're, of course, key partner in agricultural research. And this project is a transdisciplinary project into mixed cropping systems. And the underlying assumption there is that when it comes to agricultural systems, monocultural production has a number of disadvantages, including environmental degradation. And mixed cropping in this term means strip cropping. So instead of one big field of one crop, you have strips of different crops next to each other in a rotation scheme. So for instance, this could be grass next to the potato, oats next to the cabbage. And if you do that, the idea is it might lead to more biodiversity on the field, below the field in the soil, might lead to more resilience to pests, and maybe even to higher production rates. So this is a transition pathway for Dutch agriculture in a way. But there are many questions there, like which crops to mix in which ways, how can farmers engage with this new practice, what does it mean for them and their business models, how can policy support it. So that is why this is a transdisciplinary consortium, also including 25 farmers who experiment on their land with these new types of practices. And the project has these labs, these living labs. And what happens in these labs is that actors, particularly the societal partners in the project, so the value chain partners and the farmers, they come together and they articulate based on their own learning experiences, the problems and the challenges they face in this new way of doing agriculture. Around dedicated topics, could be about the machinery, could be about if you want to create short value chains instead of the longer ones. And there we create this process, a structured process of learning and reflection, and about identifying solutions together and experimenting with options for change. And in a way, I thought this is a nice example of democratic experimentation, because it is one of these examples of knowledge democratization, where we open up the scientific, traditional scientific world, luckily, to all these societal perspectives that also have really important knowledge about the farming system itself, about the policy surrounding it. So it's a nice example of knowledge democratization. And hopefully, of course, what the project aims to do is to incorporate these insights and the experimental outcomes of these living labs into the research on the more, maybe the natural science partners in the project, etc. So there's this interaction between science and society happening there. And hopefully, again, also the solutions and the pathways that come out are a bit more socially robust, place-based, as David also mentioned. But it also triggered some reflections when I thought about this panel, because obviously not everything is democratic about these processes. And there are also some democratic challenges. And some of the obvious ones I think that we see recurring in the debates are, yeah, of course, it's difficult to figure out who should be involved and why and in which degree, and how to deal with those power dynamics, what to do with accountability after these types of projects or labs end. But I also thought there were one or two more fundamental reflections. And the first one is that in this project, which is about mixing crops, the most fundamental choice seems to be which crops. But this is not a choice that is up for democratic deliberation in the project. And that's interesting. And there are quite good reasons for that. For instance, there are agronomic principles about the number of crops you need for crop rotation schemes. There are, let's say, scientific disciplinary requirements for what makes good research about a particular crop. There are, of course, sectoral, if you look at the agricultural sector, some crops just need to be investigated because they're so important for the Dutch agricultural sector, like potatoes. So there are all kinds of choices being made before these democratic processes even start. So that I think is interesting, because democratic experimentation, I think, hardly ever starts from scratch. And what we are now trying to investigate is, okay, what are these path dependencies and the choices that can be made within the context of such an experiment, and what is already decided upon before, and how can we understand those dynamics there. Then the final point, I think I've less than a minute left, is that when it comes to making choices in these types of experiments or living lab settings, I think the literature often emphasizes that democracy in this is in the opening up part. So including more voices, more diversity, more perspectives. But when it comes to transformation, there's really this urgency of closing down. And I think we need to think about what does that mean for how we see the democratic nature of these types of experiments? How can we combine the closing down and the opening up in ways that are maybe democratic enough? Or, of course, there are different forms of democracy that we can practice there, and we're now trying to figure out in the project how does that happen or not? And as our own personal research line, I would like to explore a bit, like, how can we make it democratic enough? Maybe if too democratic might become challenging in practice. So that might be a point for discussion. Thanks.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Julia. I think you have to unmute the room and not your own computer.
Sorry, you're unmuted. Yes, so thanks a lot, Chris. I think it was a great example, bringing living labs as a particular space that is meant for experimentation, which also already kind of has it in the title, but also seeing the democratic elements in this, and again, the importance of different forms of knowledge. So we will stay in Europe, but move to Spain with with an example from a grassroots initiative in the food sector in Spain. So Jakob's Messert just recently finished his PhD on democratic practices and grassroots initiatives, and is also a farmer himself. So here we have one person bringing together different types of knowledge as well. So the floor is yours to check out.
Hi everyone. So I'm joining from France, indeed, from my new farm, which is still being renovated. And I did my PhD research on democratic praxis in different grassroots agri-food collectives. So collective farms, consumer buying groups, autonomous peasant initiatives across Europe. And one of the chapters of my PhD was actually concerned with the question of how modern human political communities emerge in practice on and around farms. And for this question, I studied a land use cooperative in the Catalan Pyrenees that runs a regenerative farm. And the farm brings together a variety of modern human actors. So there were human people trying to take care of the land, trying to develop their agricultural activity. There were dogs, a herd of sheep, cows, insects, pests. There was an old abandoned forest which hadn't been managed well over the last decade, which had been abandoned. So a lot of actors like intertwined in those agro ecosystems. And when I was doing my field work, I noticed that these modern human actors were doing politics together in a lot of different ways. What they were doing is they were actually explicitly or implicitly negotiating the premises, the terms, and the practices of living together. And in this negotiation, I observed practices of multi-species care, of overt conflict between actors, of tense coexistence with insects and pests, and also of autonomous action within this community. And so while initially my fieldwork was much based on interviews and observation and being in the ecosystem, I wanted to better understand the dynamics and tension between these life forms. And that's why, together with my research participants, I organized a multi-species assembly where each human member of the cooperative embodied a specific modern human actor of the farm. And so these actors were all convened into a deliberative political arena to discuss a fictitious threat of the farmhouse being evicted and the land being fenced off for a nature reserve. So I invented a scenario that would threaten the existence of the farm and of the surrounding land. And I convened these modern human actors to discuss or see how they would be try to respond to those threats. So basically, the assembly consisted of a collective speculation exercise, and I tried to analyze the dynamics between the different modern human actors. I tried to look at the posture each actor adopted and the types of interventions they made. And what's interesting is that the different modern human actors proposed a variety of solutions to deal with the threat of eviction. One example is that the forest proposed to stop doing photosynthesis to actually punish the project developers for trying to evict them, to try to asphyxiate actually the project developers. Of course, we can ask if that's really possible, but this is the type of a creative solution some of the modern human actors proposed. And I also witnessed the emergence of various conflicts between the different humans, like the humans that are from the village versus the humans that were from the cooperative, and shifting alliances between the soil, the fauna surrounding the farm, and the forest. I won't go into detail on that now. The point is that rather than a real political arena, the multi-species assembly served as a methodological tool to understand the modern human politics that play out in a given agro-ecosystem. But I think it also constituted a collective learning processes about the conflicts and the alliances that take place in practice, And for the humans of the comparative, it also a change of perspective. It's a real attempt to try to embody other than human actors and their life worlds, and try to reason and think from these life worlds, from these realities. And what they were invited to do is then see, like from there, which questions this raises about their community and about how they want or can live together with these different species. And so more fundamentally, for like analytical perspectives, I think the assembly raised questions about agency and intentionality. So what is an actor actually capable of? Can the forest actually decide to stop photosynthesis? A second one is the limits to deliberation. I wrote about it in other parts of my PhD, but are deliberative arenas the most adequate areas to make more than human interest emerge and to actually act upon them? And this is linked with yeah, the limits also to representation and the violence that can be inherent in representation. Who is actually allowed to speak on behalf of whom, and can a human actor actually represent the complex webs of relations, for example, that a healthy soil is composed of? And what violence do you enact as humans if you actually attempt to represent the soil or the forest? And finally, yeah, the standard question, I think, about politics and democracy is the one of inclusion and exclusion. Like, whose voices does this type of assembly make visible, and whose voices are made invisible in these assemblies? So these are questions that we might get back to during the discussion, and thank you for your attention. Sorry for the slide over time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Yeah, I think that's a super valuable contribution, also bringing in the more than human, which I think is often overlooked when we talk about democratic process, especially because it's often quite focused on speech. So quite an interesting contribution. I think I'll continue with an example from from Denmark. So I actually forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. So my name is Via Chesich. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Utrecht. I'm currently here in Sydney for a research visit. So I would like to bring in an example from an autonomous community in a liberal democracy. So they are actually quite large experiment trying to self-govern based on principles of consensus-based decision-making. They emerged at the beginning in 1971, so a group of hippies and also people that just felt they didn't fit into society, occupied military barracks in Copenhagen. And from this grew a community that are of now 1,000 people that have been able to quite autonomously govern themselves in Copenhagen. It's Europe's largest and oldest squatted settlement, so with 50 years around. They have quite an interesting relationship also to state structures. Especially in the early years, often been framed as a social experiment, also because they include, they have a quite diverse community. They range from activists with like explicit political motivations, challenging capitalism, but also a lot of people who just kind of want to be left alone, want to do their own thing, a lot of artists, a lot of people also that cannot actively contribute to the communities because for instance, of mental challenges. So it's an extremely diverse community, it's quite different from, I think, a lot of the typical suspects in ecological, otherwise ecological communities. At the same time, as I said, they aim to self-govern based on principles of consensus-based decision-making. They have community meetings at kind of the local level, so they have 14 community levels like neighborhood meetings. So at the community level of like 20, 50 people. And they also have a large general assembly where everyone comes together, where they take major decisions for the community. So major strategic decisions. They also have more vertical groups that are focused on specific topics, where representatives or delegates from the community meetings come in. So it's quite a complex decision-making structure. But they are also struggling with especially this large consensus-based decision-making in the General Assembly, also because their types of decisions that they need to make are becoming more and more complex. So originally it was really about building up a community, constructing buildings, how do we want to work together? But now they are faced more and more with threats also from the state. So the state is trying to, well, in a way, normalize them. So they've been posed an ultimatum either to buy the land that they are based on or leave. And in response, they've set up a foundation that, well, so they've bought part of the land based on voluntary contributions. Now, recently, they've accepted actually a grant from the state in return for putting up social housing in the community. So we see that the state is more and more gaining influence, and so a lot of also bureaucratic procedures are coming in, which complicates the decisions that they need to make. And so a lot of people also feel in these general meetings that they don't really understand what's going on anymore. They can't really participate. After 50 years, there's also a lot of tiredness, burnout with regard to all the meetings. So there are a lot of challenges also in these democratic practices. What is in terms of transformation also interesting is their entanglement with the capitalist economy. So they are challenging capitalist tendencies in many ways. For instance, the houses that they are not privately owned. They are always part of the community. So when you move there, you can kind of occupy the building for the time that you're there, that you live. But then it goes back to the community, and you're also responsible for the upkeep of housing. They have a relatively low use in terms of certain materials, so they recycle a lot. They use things that are not needed anymore. Also put an emphasis on environmental building materials, but they wouldn't consider, or large majority wouldn't consider themselves as ecological. So this is more an outcome of trying to be independent from the structures. At the same time, we also see that a lot of the people that live there actually work on the outside. So there's still this linkage to the existing economic system, and also other people coming in working in Christiania, which also, on the other hand, so increases the impact that they have on the outside. So there are about 3,000 people that regularly visit Christiania, in addition to millions of tourists that come every year. So it's highly interlinked. It's not separate, as for instance, many eco-villages might be. But yeah, there are many challenges, many changes going on that also challenge or threaten the community, or require them to renew their identity, their democratic decision-making structures. Yeah, I will leave it at that. Yeah, so this is, I would say, a quite different case from the other ones we've heard, because they really are quite autonomous, have been around for such a long time. I mean, there are of course also a lot of similar dynamics, like different forms of knowledge, for instance, coming together for deliberative decision making as well. Now we'll move from the more local level to the national level with Madeleine Egan, who's at the Center for Deliberative Democracy in Canberra, and she'll bring in the example of deliberative constitution making in Chile. The floor is yours, Madeleine.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, so the case I'd like to discuss is Chile's recent constitution making process, which is really part of a deliberative wave of constitution making that began in Latin America in the 80s and now includes many cases around the world. And constitution making in this deliberative wave can be characterized by efforts to involve the public in deliberation within a context of diminishing trust in institutions. And I'm not going to frame this case explicitly in terms of sustainability transformations, except to say that it is bound up with issues of environmental justice. and the privatization of water, which has been enabled by the existing constitution in Chile, is one example of that. So in 2019, Chile's estallido, or social explosion, saw many millions of people protesting about persistent inequality and distrust of political elites. One of the demands to emerge from that mass movement was a new constitution. And under immense pressure, the ruling and opposition parties signed an agreement setting out a process to rewrite the constitution. And this process was, in many respects, a radical experiment that responded to the radical mood of the estallido. So it adopted features that are typical of the deliberative wave, including elections for a constituent body to draft the new text. And this body created an extensive schedule of public participation. Then there was an exit plebiscite where citizens could either ratify or reject the new constitutional proposal. This process also adopted features that are relatively novel in the history of constitution making, and that includes gender parity for the constituent body and an emphasis on grassroots forms of participation. The constituent elections, in the first instance, there were actually two processes, but for the first process, really brought some outsiders to the drafting table. So that included social movement actors, politically inexperienced citizens, and representatives from Chile's 10 recognized Indigenous groups. The text that they drafted was a clear departure from the status quo. It emphasized social and environmental rights, decentralized power, and established direct citizen participation in policymaking. But this proposal was rejected by a majority of voters at the exit plebiscite, and that led to a second, more elite-mediated process that was also unsuccessful. So the reflection that I'd like to share on this case relates to what I'll call endemic participation. And by this, I mean the kinds of participatory structures that are mobilized in times of political crisis. So in this case, one of the most significant forms of participation were cabildos, or grassroots public assemblies. This is the kind of political space that's got very deep roots in Chile. So cabildos have served as a form of resistance to unresponsive power going back to the colonial period. In contemporary Chile, cabildos have become more common as citizens are really seeking to defy a trend in elite and technocratic forms of governance. So in this context, cabildos serve as a space where ordinary people can participate in public debate and problem solving. They're grassroots spaces which can appeal to citizens who have very little trust in institutional politics, and they maintain a flat structure, and that really allows citizens to participate on equal terms and as experts in their own lives. So in the early days of the estallido, cabildos were being organized in a very ad hoc manner. There were neighbors meeting in local parks, students meeting in a university, but soon, as the constituent process got underway, there were cabildos that were organized by civil society organizations, and these tended to be more thematic. So there were prisoners meeting to discuss their rights, or activists meeting to discuss what an ecological constitution might look like, for example. The enthusiasm with which Chileans participated in cabildos is really like a remarkable aspect of the case. There were more than 150,000 people who took part in cabildos during the estallido and throughout the constituent process, and that represents about 1 in 50 people over the age of 14. So that's quite a vibrant public sphere where there are ordinary citizens participating en masse in a relatively egalitarian form of public discourse. So that leaves us with the question of why so much deliberation failed to generate any form of consensus on constitutional change. And I think one part of the answer is that a large part of this deliberation was really happening in enclaves. So self-organized spaces are much more likely to be homogenous, whether they're being held in a neighborhood, a school community, university, a prison system, etc. These are spaces where participants are more likely to share similar experiences and values and political views. That's not a problem per se, but if we look at the constituent process overall, there is an imbalance between enclave deliberation and spaces for more cross-cutting dialogue. So there were more than 17,000 self-organised meetings held prior to and during the constituent process, but just 3 processes that were convened with random stratified selection that tried to bring together citizens from different walks of life. So my reflection is really that the design of constitution-making processes in this deliberative wave might consider 2 things. Firstly, they can ask, how should endemic forms of participation be systematically incorporated into the process? And secondly, how can institutionally designed mechanisms for participation complement these endemic participatory spaces? In Chile, perhaps the focus of state-funded and organised participation needed to be spaces for more cross-cutting dialogue. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. I think that's a super valuable contribution, also because it links some of this discussion or brings in the question of how to deal with state democracies with an explicit attempt to rethink the constitution in Chile. And I think that's also something maybe we can go into a little bit later. How do we deal with existing institutions in these processes? But yeah, before we go more into on this, I would like to give the floor to our final panelist, Tobias Müller, who will bring us to the transnational level. With Extinction Rebellion as an example of a social movement advocating for climate justice. He's early career fellow of as a Leverhulme Institute at the University of Cambridge. The floor is yours, Tobias.
Yeah, thanks so much for convening this. And yeah, I just will really kind of, as the last panelist, try to keep it short and try to jump on what Madeline just said about endemic participation. And I think, in a way, a social movement very much is that. It spontaneously happens, it comes together. But of course, it's also not representative. We could talk about that later. So the case I'm going to talk about, sort of generalizing over a massive global movement. Extinction Rebellion has more than 1,000 chapters around the world. Some have risen, some have folded since it emerged 5 years ago. And I'm particularly talking about my own ethnographic and interview field work in the UK, the US, Uganda, Kenya, and Mexico. So the first thing to say, maybe in the context of this panel, is that they're not looking for a sustainability transformation in the narrower sense, but the idea is really to acknowledge that the current state we are in is one of utter emergency, and therefore our kind of whole socio-ecological political systems need to be fundamentally changed or transformed. So there's much more at stake. It's just this. So it's also a democracy transformation that they're actually looking for in their very DNA of the movement. And I think that also brings us to the why this initiative, or why movements actually are important to look at. Just yesterday, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, the former president of the American Sociological Association and a kind of key theorist of race, kind of expounding all the ideas that we could have to achieve racial justice. And he said, we need social movements. At the end of the day, you need to build power. And how do you build that power? And this we have seen obviously with gender equality, labor rights, anti-racism, or historical decolonization is through movements. And that's why I think they're really important and exciting space to look at, democratic experimentation as well. So what also is particularly interesting maybe for this purpose is that one of the 3 demands, apart from telling the truth about the ecological emergency, acting now for carbon neutrality in 2025, that was the demand back then, was to go beyond politics. So the idea was there is deep partisan divides, and the idea was we need to somehow across that and beyond politics. That was kind of their demand that then also was in itself contested think now it's called update democracy. So there's a kind of democracy demand about citizens' assemblies and like how do we get there to those radical transitions through citizens' assemblies. And that was kind of a key part of the culture of the movement, also often in streets, like we blocked I say we because I'm kind of as a scholar activist also participating, a bridge, and then suddenly you sit down on the bridge and you have hundreds of people and say, okay, let's do a people's assembly right now, right here. How are we going to do? Are we going to leave? Or are we going to get arrested by the police? So this is kind of very much from the grassroots up to we need this at a national and obviously a transnational level as well. So they also wanted to kind of pull the question of radical ecological change out of the lefty corner. So they wanted to kind of not only use kind of language that is used by the progressive people and really kind of, mobilize the ordinary farmer, if you want, as well. And another element that I think is interesting in terms of democracy is their emphasis on spontaneous organization and decentralized organization. So you can just come up and be like we could now found the XR chapter of sustainability transformation if we adhere to certain like guiding principles, nonviolence, and mitigating for power. So we could decide this right now, and we would be part of the movement. And that, as you can imagine, has been empowering for a lot of people in different places. Of course, leads also to a lot of clashes because they come with their own ideas what they want to do. But I think it provided a screen for projection as well that was really mobilizing and empowering for people. And I think that's also crucial for the understanding of democracy, which second part I want to talk about is obviously much more than decision making. So Julia kindly asked us also, okay, democratic decision making, let's really focus on that. But I think it's also important to see like democracy obviously is about decision making, but it's also about people's power, and that's certainly the vision of the movement. People's power as compared to corporate, state, and media power, and how is that being built? The decision-making model that was ultimately adopted or practiced was between holacracy and sociocracy. So there was a complex system of kind of different circles that then had representatives and other circles. So it's kind of a model of councils, if you want, kind of a Bolshevik model, if you want. But ultimately, the problem was also speaking about the limitations that actually that one was still very local or national. So there was never a real way to lift up that to the national level. And also the problem was that there were also, because there were little formalized decision making, there was actually often certain individuals that really gained a lot of power, and that had diverse effects. Particularly, often it was actually older white men who ultimately became the ones that were just always in the meetings and therefore gaining a lot of power. The last point I want to make is about the type of collectivity that emerges. And very often they use the slogan, it's nature defending itself. And there was a lot of artivism or kind of artistic representation of animals, of ecosystems, and so on. Every time, bring that in the street. Now, that's not a kind of collective imagination as Jacob had, but it is a sense of how do we understand ourselves as nature, as a collectivity, and being on the streets with the respective ecological collectivities. So I think it is an attempt to think that and embody that, even though it's not directly translated in decision making. So I think that's also another crucial element to think about. Julia asked me to wrap up, so I'll stop here, but I'm looking forward to this conversation very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. Thank you to all the panelists. I think that gave a wonderful sense of the variety of what we might discuss as democratic experimentation, and also the different challenges associated with sustainability, transformation, and of course also the questions of justice, inclusion, power. I don't want to take up more time. I want to give also the chance to the participants to raise questions. Also, I would also explicitly invite you to, if you have other cases you would like to bring in, feel free also to take that space. In terms of technicality, I think it's good if you write or raise your hand, perhaps, so we can give you the right to speak. I know that there was a question from question by Jonathan, so maybe we can start with you, and yeah, the others feel free to raise your hands so we know that you have something like to contribute. So Jonathan, I would give the floor directly to you so you can pose your question yourself.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And thanks to all of them for great presentations today. Yeah, question is initially for David, and it was about this idea of social infrastructure. And yeah, I think it's a really useful, productive way of thinking about infrastructure and sort of extending the idea. But yeah, I guess is in my comments there, I wondered about that difference between sort of good and bad forms of social infrastructure that just potentially, as we might imagine, that there are kind of good and bad forms of resilience that we might need to disentangle certain types of infrastructure that could be good for democratic practices and those that might be that might be counterproductive. Yeah, any thoughts on that? And how do we, sorry, and then how do we differentiate the two, and how do we cultivate the good ones and maybe disband the bad ones?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, thanks for turning around my question in an earlier discussion right back on me. It just reminds me of that old Chambers and Klopstein piece about bad civil society, right? Civil society that promotes association at the same time it promotes things like hate, and certainly something we're seeing more of across the globe in the US, here elsewhere. So yeah, certainly. And even in democratic experimentation, as I said in an earlier session, there's plenty of warnings about sort of fake or fake democratic experimentation or fake ecopolitics that are really explicitly linked to more authoritarian or nationalist or xenophobic ideologies and imaginaries. There's a Tanneman wrote a recent piece on the German far right, and a colleague of mine in Helsinki has done the same with the Finnish right-wing party. So yeah, I get that, and I think that's something to be addressed. I think for us here, I mean, really, Jonathan, to be frank, but our main focus here is in raising the voices and concerns of those local community groups to the state. So, the state actually just paid one of the private consulting companies to develop a tool for local councils to measure social infrastructure. Thankfully, they came to us for some consultation, and we prevented the state really, I mean, it was a big fight from only measuring buildings, right? The state just wanted to, they just wanted churches and cafes and libraries, and it was a real argument to get them to agree that process and relationship and civil society organization, things that didn't have that same kind of physicality, were really important social infrastructure when it came to measuring, what local councils need to invest in order to assist communities survive these kinds of turbulent emergencies. So that's really been our main focus. And I mean, it's a really interesting question also because in a lot of these, I mean, it'd be really interesting to do some comparison work, because we're seeing this kind of stuff in the US, the right-wing attack on emergency services and emergency organizing and all of that. Didn't happen here in Australia. That kind of party politics disappeared, and you had neighbor helping neighbor, not asking what their political party or authoritarian leaning was at the time. So yeah, I mean, theoretically, I get the question. When you've got a 1,000-year flood, I'm not sure it's at the top of the mind of people saving each other's lives. Is that a fair enough answer, Jonathan?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was thinking of just more in the conceptual sense, perhaps. That there are those two sides to it. But yes, absolutely. I think the IPCC also talks about social infrastructure, right, as well. So it's not like you're going out on a limb there. And yeah, I think just
But I think you're absolutely right. Now I need to go back and read that old James and Copstein piece on bad civil society. I think that's a good point.
Okay, are there other questions from the audience? Oh, Madeleine, you would like to respond? Go ahead or ask something.
Thanks, Julia. I just thought I'd jump in with another kind of response to Jonathan's question, because I think there's sort of some close relationship between what David's describing in social infrastructure and in what I've sort of been looking at in terms of endemic participation. And I think what I suppose what came to mind for me when I read your question, Jonathan, was just that, well, sometimes the same infrastructure can have normatively desirable and undesirable effects. And so that's also an important question that we need to be asking ourselves in these types of crises.
Yeah, there's a point raised by Sarah, which is quite important. Would you like to bring it up yourself? Or would you prefer me to read it out?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right, okay. Yeah, my question is more related to the polycrisis and decision making and the spaces where it's talked about. Because I noticed with a lot of the research I'm doing, it's very much this topic that is talked about in the global north, and it's very much talked about and not talked with the people who are mostly experiencing this. And I was wondering if one of you has a take on this, or how we could make these spaces more inclusive, more intersectionality, and yeah, that.
Like to respond? Yes, go ahead.
Thanks for raising that. So that's been a key concern in the movement I've been studying, kind of being a global north movement at the beginning, but also at the beginning there being loads of people of color, kind of Pan-African activists doing their own sort of democratic experimentation by connecting communities of resistance. And what we've seen kind of continuously is a massive kind of split within the movement, actually in most countries that I've been working in the US, certainly in Mexico as well, along the question of race. So first I would say, if you talk about making spaces more inclusive already, I think you're lost. I think you need to recreate spaces from the ground up that they are achieving that goal of racial justice and of global justice as a kind of global north-south justice. And secondly, maybe it's not us in that sense then who have that question actually coming up with those spaces in the first place. So very often these communities exist, their organization exists, their struggle exists, and it has existed certainly against colonialism and ecocide for 500 years. So the other approach that people I work with then take is, can we connect those already existing struggles? And just one example, and I quit with that. In a month's time, it's the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Conference. And so different African communities and indigenous peoples are leading an organization of a kind of Berlin reparations conference in Berlin, drawing on the existing networks and talking about genocide and ecocide together. And that's a space that's led by people of color from the global south and Black people, and very different spaces emerge. And not once has the question of inclusion been asked, because it's not a question if those actually holding the power and making the decisions are from those respective communities.
Thank you.
Hey, do we have other questions from the audience? Yeah, otherwise, I think one point that came up was the question of experimentation. So I think it was already also, for instance, something that David already explored a little bit. So what does it actually mean to experiment? So looking at your initiatives, where do you see aspects of experimentation? And what would your understanding, or also from the perspective of the case of experimentation, be? I think Chris elaborated a little bit, David elaborated a little bit on this, but maybe the others could respond to that. Madeleine, would you like to?
I think Christian raised his hand.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I said go ahead, Madeleine, but I can start and then we have time. I think it's a really interesting question, and I've often wondered myself, where is the experimentation? And I think it's in many different things. So it might become a bit hard to distinguish whether it's part of the processes that we set up, whether it is very like an experiment in the traditional scientific sense of the word, can also be something that we do in living labs, for instance, or field experiments with agriculture. So where is the boundary between that type of experimentation and more I don't know, democratic processes that we try to establish? But I think it's mostly maybe in, this is going to sound a bit more vague than I intended, but in the mindsets, right? It's a way of governing. So it is about exploring, it's about iteration, it's about building in reflection on choices, on directions, and steering along the way. I would say that's how we tend to see it in these types of living labs. But I can imagine there are many other perspectives.
Jacob, maybe looking at your case, because there the entry point also was more from this, well, I mean, in the agri-food collectives you studied, so not particular in the multi-level multi-species assembly. To what extent would you say there does experimentation take place in terms of democracy also?
Yeah, I think in this case study, but more globally in all the collectives I studied, the experimentation lies in the creation of different institutions for different like topics that emerge, either through like things that happen to the collective or questions that are raised by people of the collective. And so I tended to look at it a lot in terms of the question of feminism and anti-sexism is raised in the collective because something happens, and then seeing how a community or a collective like responds to that and what institutions they create to either discuss this or change things in the way they organize. And for me, this experimentation is really in that like going as like learning as we speak and going with the things that happen and that occur. And yeah, I would look at it in terms of institution, and it's like institution in a broad sense, in a like the rules and practices and norms that govern the community, and that are hopefully in democratic societies created by those people or those actors that are affected by this and concerned by this.
David?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. It's a really good question. I want to tell about something that happened where an experiment was generated out of a series of experiments. So I talked about these resilience organizations, and so we did this research, and we have researchers who are based in this particular region of the Northern Rivers, which had some really hideous flooding. And the researchers went out to a number of different communities, talked to a number of different resilience organizations in different neighborhoods and parts of the region. And there was a real desire to share stories, to tell stories. And actually what happened as a result of the research was the generation of a new alliance of resilience organizations across the entire region. And so we sort of funded them to get up and running. And now we have not just these sort of local neighborhood, really basic, not basic, but based in place organizations, but now we have this broad regional network of these organizations being really reflexive about what worked, what didn't work, sharing those stories with each other, learning from one another about that emergency response. And so it's been this really generative creation of this sort of another new form coming out of these. And what is really interesting about that, in addition just to actually getting it up, is that the state has announced that forward-looking adaptation plan is going to happen at a regional level rather than at a local level, which is kind of odd thing for the state because there's no actual existing governance at a regional level at all. And yet, in this one place, we've already seen the development of potential regional governance or input to regional governance coming up from the grassroots, from the responses of the community. So I mean, part of what I've been talking about is the sort of the generative nature of climate turbulence, and how that's really pushed people to think differently about democratic processes, and that's happening in real time in a number of instances.
Madeleine, did you want to add something to the previous point?
Well, yeah, I suppose, like very quickly to say that, yeah, perhaps that point about the generative power of the climate crisis can be broadened as well. You know, there's all kinds of crises, including some democratic crises, that can prompt democratic experimentation and innovation. You know, Latin America is a region that's really well known for having been at the forefront of many of those innovations. And on the theme of experimentation, more generally, in the case of the constitution making in Chile, I think although the process itself is an institutional one, if we look at some of the most experimental aspects of the process, including the gender parity for the constituent body, that is something that's been pushed for by social movements. The demand for that has come from social movements. The political pressure to make it a reality came through social movements as well. And it's been interesting because although in the second constituent process, which was more elite mediated, heavily right-wing dominated in the end, the gender parity remained. It was sort of essentially the only like key feature of the first process that survived into the second process. So it sort of has become institutionalized in some sense. People now expect it.
Great, thanks. Maybe we can move. So there's another question by Dakila, and I think it's also a good transition or going back to a question of inclusion, exclusion. Dakila, would you like to raise it yourself?
Sorry, you want to just read it? Or I can just respond really quickly. Look, that's a great question just about differences in participation across class or socioeconomic lines. And the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, Northern Rivers in particular, the different experiences of Aboriginal communities and white communities, I mean, it's just huge. And, you know, whereas white communities, it's sort of very similar to environmental justice in the US, where white communities are sort of surprised at first the state wasn't coming to the rescue. You know, Aboriginal communities, like, well, what did you expect? You know, so I think the question that, yeah, and so I mean, obviously, a lot of the response is by those who have been made most vulnerable by bad existing policy, bad housing policy, bad evacuation, you know, all kinds of bad flood control policy, all of that. But they have been made vulnerable, and so they are active. But you also have those with resources as well. And so, like some of our researchers, they got involved because they were some of the houses that didn't get flooded out, and so they were cooking and doing laundry for other people in the community for weeks, right? And so because they hadn't been flooded, they felt a responsibility to others. And so there was, and I'm not saying this is, it was a big, all the problems of class and social division were solved, but there were certainly some outreach internally across those divides, but there's still a lot of bitterness in communities that were made vulnerable by that policy, and communities that weren't made right by bad decisions by the state afterward, who to reward, who to buy out in terms of houses that were no longer that. So I think there's a lot of work left to be done on the part of the state.
So the question of how do these initiatives relate to the state, and I guess also to economic system, is of course something quite central and also keeps coming up. So I would like to ask, whoever would like to reflect on that. To what extent do you think these initiatives can contribute to transformations within existing structures, and to what extent do they need to step outside? Because there's of course always this tension, like increasing impact, increasing outreach might be more achievable by engaging with the structures, but then it also impacts the radicality, the transformative quality. So maybe you could reflect on this from the perspective of the experiences. Chris, perhaps?
Yeah, I could. Did you say Chris?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking about it. But I think what you highlight is exactly the challenge. And the example I just mentioned is an example of an agricultural project, but we also do a lot of work with, let's say, experimental, innovative policy programs on the national government level, for instance. And then this is exactly the key challenge. And there's no solution yet. So what we see happening is that depending a bit on the timing, people shift strategies. So for some aspects, they would seek to move slightly outside of the system to create a particular type of impact. But then when they see, it becomes difficult, they move back inside. So it's a bit of navigating the boundaries there, I think, which requires quite something from the people involved. But yeah, so far I unfortunately do not have a solution for that challenge, but maybe others have.
The other panelists like to respond to that question?
Maybe just briefly, Extinction Rebellion wanted to overthrow all the structures, but where they ended up actually maybe having most impact is by bringing people together and actually then somehow working with some organization. So I think kind of the claim of what you actually want to transform and what it actually does often is different. But that's also, in a way, that's also from a democratic perspective, that's perfectly fine. There's a certain kind of being then more institutionalized. I think it also leads to a lot of frustration because those who want the more radical change then feel that actually they have been betrayed or the movement has betrayed itself. But I think we should never underestimate the personal links between, let's say, the farmers that Jacob works with people that then end up in a local government. I've seen it in Mexico, a lot of kind of those people who get sparked by the movement then end up working for the local authority and suddenly become really kind of key parts of the state. Whereas others then go into more kind of anarchist, radical anti-capitalist collectives because that's what they want to do. So I feel many of those experimental spaces also like traversed by journeys of people in and out of spaces. And of course, they take their experiences with themselves. And I think thereby, also ideas and kind of the radicality percolates. But it's certainly a moderation and a radicalization that's going on constantly in different directions.
Would like to add something to this? No. I would also like to give the panelists the opportunity if you have a quick question to one of the other panelists. Jacob, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I had a small question to you, Julia, because the experiments that has been going on in Christiania, I think it has been like a lot discussed, a lot of like a big reference in left-wing European and activist circles and stuff. And having been there myself a couple of years ago, I was a bit struck also by um, the atmosphere, mainly related in terms of like criminality. And I was wondering if you could like explain a little bit like the challenges that come with creating free spaces within state territories, in which like different rules or different laws apply in terms of drug use, in terms of weapons. If you have like come across this, and if this is actually a topic for political discussion, and in what instances actually decisions are made about these, yeah, fundamental living together things that usually the state is covering, and that which can be criticized a lot and which should be, but how do people take these questions in their own hands in that space, or is this like a blind spot in these spaces? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really important question. It's also one of the points where Christiania is in a moment of transformation also in this regard, because it puts us street, so the kind of street where cannabis was sold openly and was also major tourist attraction has been closed down as a consequence of violent shootings there last year. So the community is undergoing, yeah, as I said, massive changes, and so there was always this consensus in the community, or from quite early on, not to do any kind of hard drugs, and that was also quite well implemented throughout the community. But there have always been occurrences where in the early years where also gangs have tried to push these harder drugs. But overall, it has been limited to cannabis. But even like the street has kind of been taken over in recent years by these gangs. So they've actually decided to collaborate with the police in order to address this, because there have been previous attempts to close down the street that have not been successful. So you see a lot more presence of police forces there now. I think we will see how this goes. It's a little bit too early to tell because they closed it down in May, but it also changes the community dynamics because the pushers have also been quite a central part within the community. So yeah, this can present a problem, certainly. Okay, I think we have another question. John Dreisek, would you like to speak up and ask a question yourself? Do you want to find a question?
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I'll just read it out. Okay, so just wondering about a relationship, if any, between Extinction Rebellion style insistence on truth, urgency, and comprehensive action on the one hand, and the place-based knowledge and place-based knowledge / action on the other. Is there any tension between them, or are we just talking about different worlds of action? Yeah, I mean, it's a...
Yeah, thanks, John, if I may take this. Absolutely. So I think what we are kind of seeing, if you look more historically at the environmental movement, a lot of political theorists have claimed that environmental movement often is like kind of critical of expertise in science and so on. And I think this kind of since the last 5-6 years, this kind of follow the science and very kind of scientism in climate movements have become very, very strong. And there has been a pushback, particularly obviously by global south communities, by kind of feminist groups, by young people, and by those who are, kind of talk about front lines and frontline knowledge and that deep localized knowledge. And I think it is, so the tension plays out in different ways. So on the one hand, they try to kind of keep this, what we can agree on, kind of basically the IPCC narrative broadly. But then, of course, that is a narrative that for a lot of communities of resistance or environmental justice communities doesn't connect with them very well, because they think they have so much more experience and, well, David would say maybe kind of realities of climate turbulence already in their own lives. They don't need the IPCC to tell them that action is urgent. So I think that the way they try to negotiate that is through kind of adapting claims and kind of practices like passing on the mic of different global north groups to kind of global south direct affected communities, and having certain kind of professionalist groups like kind of doctors, which also have certain expertise kind of about global health, or for instance, Extinction Rebellion families, or farmers and so on. But I would argue globally, those kind of more place-based concrete knowledges often more serve as examples to exemplify the bigger story. And I think this has been a big tension in the movement. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about that at some point, but I'll leave it at that for here. Thank you, John.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, if I might add, because I think this is a really interesting point, and I really like what you also mentioned, Tobias. And on the other side of it, I think there's also sometimes this dynamic, which at least in my own country we experience now, that particular communities, for instance, farming communities, rural communities, with a lot of place-based knowledge and experiences of problems that they face, are standing in stark contrast to what is advocated on the side of Extinction Rebellion type of movements, or climate science. And if we think about it from a democratic point of view, that is quite a tension, I feel. So how do we, a colleague of mine sometimes says there's no truth, but there is nonsense. But how do we sometimes distinguish between what communities rightfully feel as injustices, but then it might be in contrast with something like the IPCC report in terms of urgency. But how do we deal with that? It's measuring different things, right? But it poses democratic tensions, I think.
And I think that makes a nice circle to where we started from. So this is tension between urgency or potential tension. Even though we also see that, of course, a lot of the initiatives are actually taking action a lot more than, well, as we, for instance, see with David's example, where the state is not taking action. So I think that's also something to highlight here, but it remains certainly a tension. Thank you so much for this panel. I really enjoyed your contribution. Thank you all so much for coming, also for the European participants whom it is rather early still. And thanks also for all the participants for your questions. Yeah, with that I would like to close, and I think we will keep discussing a lot of these questions. Also within, for instance, the working group on democracy of the ESG network. So if you're interested, feel free to sign up. Yeah, to keep engaged in these discussions, and then of course also in the rest of the conference. I think the topic of democracy will always be present as well. So thanks so much, and then good evening to the Australian participants, and morning rest of your day to the Europeans, or wherever you might be joining from.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.